All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Greywater Project interview series. Today, we're going to talk to Dr. Richard Godfrey. Richard joined and helped found LEAF, Local Ecology and Agriculture Fremont, in 2008, and he's an associate clinical professor of surgery at UCSF / the East Bay Surgery Residency Program. And he calls himself mostly retired, but he works with the Ashland Free Clinic and internationally. He's been working for the Prevention International of Cervical Cancer, and he participates in missions to Belize and Guatemala to eliminate cervical cancer. And his Kenya trips include supporting children's hospitals, organizing primary schools for orphans, and creating a cooperative honey business. He was once an agricultural worker with Peace Corps Nepal, and he remains an active beekeeper in the Bay Area, and he writes fiction and nonfiction. And of course, most importantly, he has a pet beagle named Darwin. So welcome. And today he's going to be talking with us about what he witnessed in Ukraine and the efforts to bring medical supplies there that otherwise would have gone to the landfill. Did I get everything?
Sure, that's great. But actually, you left one thing out, and that is where you are one of my heroes because you serve on the Environmental Sustainability Commission for the city of Fremont. It's a small group of, I think, 7 of us, and we are hoping to get back to work any day now.
Yes. I suppose I should start with the most basic of questions, which is, can you tell us more about the project that you've been working on?
Well, the most recent project is this recycling of medical supplies. I won't say it's new because I've been involved in it really for probably 15 or 20 years. I've worked for a number of hospitals with Kaiser Permanente and with the county hospital in Highland Hospital up in Oakland. And I've sort of been identified as, Godfrey's a guy he's in Doctors Without Borders, which is not the case. I work with a group called Matibabu, which means treatment in Kiswahili. But nonetheless, every time the people in the hospital collect gear that they think is close to expiration or sometimes even expired, they hand it off to me. And in the process, I've had to build about 8 sheds in my backyard to collect all this equipment. So I'm always looking for a way to deliver it.
Can you tell us a little bit more about recycling and your recent trip to Ukraine?
The week before this last week, it came up in a hurry, and I joined up with some Rotarians. And so I put together a little bit of a summary of what I discovered during that trip, but it's also related to recycling of medical equipment. So I think it's relevant in that regard. And I want to share a quote with you of someone who had a very large impact on me in my college days, and that was the work from a book called Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, who was sent into the gulags and basically was hidden away in Siberia for quite a long time. But when he came out of that, he made this statement. He said, "Show us not the aim without the way, for ends and means on earth are so entangled that changing one, you change the other too. Each different path brings other ends in view." And it was relevant in those days to Stalin's purge. It's relevant today to what's going on in Russia. But let's talk a little bit about Ukraine.
You mentioned that you wanted to talk about the history of Ukraine and how that impacts the current situation.
So just a simple map of Ukraine, and just by way of orientation, if you look on the western part of the country, you'll see the city of Lviv. That's very close to Poland. So if you decide you want to go to Ukraine, and these days you have to fly to Poland, you can't fly into Ukraine for obvious reasons. And then you take a bus and you can cross the whole country, but it takes a little while. You see Kyiv in the center, and you see Kharkiv way over in the eastern part, not too far from where the zone that is now hotly contested between Russia and Ukraine, which is in red. So a little bit of history, just, Ukraine has originally, if you go way back into the 1800s, was sort of started by the Vikings. The Scandinavians came down the Dnieper River, and back in that time, you'll recognize the name there. Prince Volodymyr was first baptized and began the Christian history of that country. And so you'll see that name, Volodymyr, and some of the people that are going to be prominent in this slide talk. And then the Mongol army came and captured Kyiv. And then in 1362, the Lithuanian army came. In the 1400s, the Cossacks came and established outposts. Then in the 1600s, there was basically wars between the Russians, Poles, Turks, Cossacks for control of Ukraine. And then ultimately, Russia and Poland sort of ended up handing Kyiv and the Cossacks to the Russian rule. Now, very simple summary, Ukraine was split between Russia and Poland through the 1700s and between Russia and Austria from 1800 and 1900. And then it went back to Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania during World Wars. And then finally, the Orange Revolution in 1991. But you can sort of understand the name Ukraine. Ukrainia actually means on the edge or borderland. And so clearly this is a piece of land that has been caught for almost entire history between other countries. And what's going on today is just another extension of that centuries, millennia struggle. So the Orange Revolution took place in 1991. Presidents came and went. Occasionally they were poisoned, such as Yushchenko, who was poisoned by the Russians with dioxin. And then they got a president by the name of Yanukovych. And he was popularly elected, but trouble came when he decided basically to back away from a trade deal with the European Union. And that led to the Maidan Revolution. And this is to understand Ukraine and really to understand anything of Eastern Europe and Russia. The Maidan Revolution is incredibly important. And it's important because, you know, if I go back in my history, when I went to school at Berkeley, we had the free speech movement, and it was a very popular movement that I think was very central in getting part of the United States and ultimately the United States to pull out of Vietnam. And it was started a lot by the students throughout the United States. Berkeley was just one part. But in the Maidan Revolution, it all took place in Kyiv. And so you're looking at Independence Square, and 400,000 protesters showed up in that square. It's the largest square in the world next to Tiananmen Square. It's really quite large. And Kiev is a beautiful city, but also with a lot of history, as you can tell just looking at the buildings. Next slide. So what happened? Well, 400,000 people basically met with the security forces of Yanukovych, and it was really an incredible battle. It all took place in the early months of January and February, so you're looking at sub-freezing temperatures. People were camped out in this Independence Square, and ultimately there was more of a struggle between the troops and the people, to the point that violence developed and they started fires. They took over buildings. Snipers went up in the buildings and started taking out many of these young people as they stayed in the square. It got really, really quite violent. And as you can see, 121 deaths and 1,400 injuries, probably was more than that. But basically, towards the end of this time period, around February 28th of 2014, the president jumped in a plane and flew out of the country, ultimately ending up in Russia. Next, led to independence and a new rulership that was much more favorable to joining with Europe, which Russia did not appreciate. And so as a result, this war has now been going on. That started back in oh gosh, I guess it was February of this year, and it's still ongoing. It's going to reach a full year before too long. Already there's been 100,000 people killed on the Ukrainian side and probably more than 100,000 troops killed on the Russian side. So it's a rugged war.
So how did you get involved in all of this?
And why did I get involved in all this? Well, I'm part of Rotary, and I've worked towards providing medical supplies in many different countries in Africa and Central America. But I felt strong sympathy for the people of Ukraine. They were attacked without any notice by the Russian troops, and they were remarkably able to hold back the Russian army from invading and taking over Kyiv and from taking over much of the country. But at the same time, the Ukrainian people were without supplies, which is true today. So my interest was the last mile. And the last mile refers to when we do these transports of medical supplies to lower and middle income countries, it sometimes is very difficult. Just by example, in order for me to have sent equipment to Kenya, other than taking suitcases in my own travels, to send a 40-foot container costs between $10,000 and $30,000. And then once it gets to the country, it has to get through customs. And if it's not perfectly organized, and everything is non-expired, they'll reject it. But if everything is perfect, they're still going to charge a value-added tax, and that can be in the range of $5,000 to $7,000. I sent a container to Kenya a couple years ago, and I thought, well, they could always use a bicycle, so I threw a little bicycle into the back of the container. Well, they said, well, that's a violation. That'll cost you another $10,000. But this is a problem. And it's a problem from an environmental standpoint, because some of the worst environmental landfill waste comes from hospitals. And as an example, each hospital produces around 29 pounds of waste daily. So if you add that up all over the US, that amounts to about 5 million tons of waste. Most of that will go to landfill. Some of it will just go into storage. But the bottom line is it doesn't get utilized. And so it's a tremendous, I think, example of where we don't do well in the efforts of recycling. You can probably think of many better examples, but this is the one I'm most involved.
That's really interesting. And what is the cost involved? I imagine by not utilizing these supplies, hospitals and pharmaceutical companies are leaving a bunch of money on the table.
And if you were to look at the costs of this, I'm just referring now to pharmacies, not to the medical equipment. So as you saw before, around 5 million tons of medical equipment, well, that probably is in the range of $3 to $4 to $5 billion. And then you can add another $5 billion of U.S. waste of viable medications from U.S. pharmacies. I invite you, any of you that are thinking about going into medicine, I hope you pay attention to some of the journals and some of the literature on this. Why is this the case? Well, that gets into a much bigger subject of how we practice medicine in America, that is market-based, but it's very market-based in our pharmacies and in the pharmaceutical world. And how does that work out? Well, if you take a drug and you say its half-life is, let's say, 8 months, when in fact that drug is probably good for a year and a half, you've made a lot more money, because every time you put it on the shelves, a lot of it won't get sold, and that'll get thrown away, and then you have to restock your shelves. We said, okay, we're not going to be able to get this shipped in easily. And in this particular case, these were all medications that were donated to me from Highland Hospital in Oakland, because they had been given to the hospital for COVID and they couldn't utilize them in time. And so they reached an expiration time, but they're perfectly good. And you see probably, anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000 worth of antibiotics there. They are expired, but they're perfectly good. So what do? We load them up in suitcases and we take them on the airplane. And by the way, in that, if you look at the suitcase on the far right, those you won't recognize, but those are called external fixators. External fixators are what you use to take care of fractures. So in a war zone and in a major country, there's going to be a lot of automobile accidents. There's going to be a lot of injuries from military combat. And so that you need external fixators to take care of broken bones. So when we do surgery in our hospitals, for example, in Highland Hospital, we'll use an external fixator to set a bone. And then what do? They throw it away. It goes straight to the pathology department, and then they put it into landfill. Well, those external fixators cost around $3,000 a piece, and you can use them for 30 or 40 times. So it's another example of just, quite a bit of waste. And I always save them, and I autoclave them and make them safe again, and then we take them to the countries that we travel.
So how did you cover the cost of this trip?
We did a benefit, and this is a group of us, including Ukrainians. And my friend, you're going to learn a little bit about him, runs a winery. If you ever want to do a nice benefit, I recommend Bill Smythe. But anyway, this is Westover Winery, located in Fremont, not far from Stanford. We started off in Warsaw. It was a 20-hour ride. And we took that bus all the way to the east side of Ukraine. Now, here we are in Kharkiv. Well, I should have mentioned, so we had these suitcases. We had 5 big suitcases just packed with gear. And, we got through Poland. They never looked at it. We walked right through customs, went right through security. Then we got to the Ukrainian side. And there they put our suitcases through the, just like when you go through an airport, they go through a little bit of radar inspection. And so they wanted to open up one of the suitcases, and we opened it up. And usually when I do this in foreign countries, and I've been not smuggling. I've been transporting suitcases for probably 15, 20 years. And you always have to have an excuse. Sometimes I just take out my medical license and I say, I'm a doctor. I'm doing this for humanity. It's a Rotarian effort. One of my partners is with, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about what we do with cervical cancer, but she takes all kinds of gear into the Kenya and Africa and India. And she says, I'm bringing in supplies so we can eliminate cervical cancer. And they look at her like, well, what are you talking about, lady? And so whenever she opens up her suitcase, she just uses one word, and it always seems to get her through. She says vagina. And they're like, okay, go on. We don't want to know anymore. So we use all kinds of ways to get it in. But the long and the short is we got our suitcases through, and we took them to Kharkiv.
Wow, that's certainly much more of a difficult process than what I was envisioning.
Kharkiv is a city on the far east side. You've probably read about it. The Ukrainian army was able to recapture this territory. This is just a little slide of what it looked like after they did some of their bombing. And here's another typical example. The Russians, when they came in and when they left, took out a lot of civilian buildings. So we visited a couple of the hospitals. This is one of the nurses. They were happy to get our suitcases full of supply. Interestingly, most of the hospitals we visited, we didn't really see many patients because there's still most of the doctors and nurses are working on the front line where all the soldiers are, and that's where the major amount of medical providing takes place. Now, by the way,
you've made it sound extremely simple, even though I'm assuming it was actually quite challenging. And you wanted to show some of the other affected areas?
Was a children's school. And that's an example of the playground. And in the background, you can see a building that's been completely demolished. Nobody can live in that building now. Next slide, except for one person. And that's this lady. We met this lady who was sweeping out the building, and she was actually staying in the building. She was not going to leave. And we said, well, gosh, how can you stand to live without any heat, without any electricity? I came back from Ukraine and saw how things were in the Bay Area. I thought we are very, very fortunate to live the way that we do. And I really admire the Ukrainian people. And so here's another building that was pretty much destroyed. You can see on the side of the building where all the shrapnel has hit into the cement. blasted away. But I was impressed because I looked down into the ground and up came the flowers in the middle of October and November. And so there's hope for Ukraine. I think Ukraine is going to rebuild. Next slide. And it's going to rebuild because of the children and the young people. Here's another slide. Go ahead, the next slide too. Just showing you that they were willing to shell almost any area very indiscriminately. So it pretty much cleaned up this school and the local playground. Next slide. Do any of you know who Banksy is? Maybe you've heard of Banksy, Shreya. Banksy, of course, anytime he sees a building, it's an opportunity for him to do a little bit of graffiti. So this just came out recently in the press, and that it's kind of hard to make out, but you see a Ukrainian acrobat doing a handstand in the middle of the back of one of these buildings. So, Banksy gets everywhere. Now, honestly, we were never in any great danger. We actually, had a lot of really nice meals. So when you have a meal in Ukraine, I think you should, if you ever go there, you should know that they're going to have toasts. So the first toasts are always to Ukraine, okay? Slava Ukraine, which means glory to Ukraine. Then they do another toast to Rotary. And then after that toast, and these little shot glasses are basically double shot glasses. So you put away a good amount of vodka by this time. Then you do your third toast, and the third toast is always to the women. So you toast to the women, and then they start over again. Okay, well, let's toast to Ukraine, and on it goes. So that's part of the Ukrainian experience. I just wanted to share that with you. Next. So
wow, that's actually a very interesting tradition. Thank you for sharing that.
So what are we doing with Rotary? Well, we are doing recycling. And our goal is to find ways to get through the last mile and to find ways to get hospitals and pharmaceutical companies to do what we should be doing throughout the country and throughout our local areas, whether it be Stanford, Palo Alto, or where Shreya and I work, which is Fremont and the Tri-City area. We really need to do this nationally. And it hasn't happened in my generation. I hope that it happens in your generation. I'm very inspired by the work Shreya does, and I want to say that this is something that needs to happen. It can happen. The pen is mightier than the sword, and I feel like ultimately we can take on some of these issues of sustainability by writing articles and educating people.
Talking a little bit more about your cervical cancer prevention missions, which you mentioned were actually your main focus.
My biggest area of work right now is still in medicine. I spent, 35 years doing surgery. I was a surgical oncologist. I probably removed somewhere around 10,000 cancers. And then I realized, wow, why was I spending all that time when the right thing to do is to prevent cancer? So we now have the ability to completely eliminate cervical cancer. We have a vaccine, and we have a new methodology and technology where we can screen older women. And so, like Rotary did with polio, Rotary took on polio as a campaign starting back in the 1980s. And in a very short sentence, they raised $1.2 billion. Bill and Melinda Gates doubled that. So they had about $3.6 billion. And that's why you see very little polio on the planet anymore. I think there's around 60 cases of active polio on the whole planet. Cervical cancer is much more widespread. It's around 350,000 women that die every year on the planet from cervical cancer. It's a devastating type of cancer to die from, and we can completely eliminate it. And it's all caused by a virus. So if we can handle and take care of the HPV virus, we will take on this larger goal. So that's my last thing about Rotary. I want to share that with you because Rotary really loves to get what we call Rotaractors. We're usually young people right in or out of college that are young. They don't want to spend a lot of money. They don't have a lot of time, but you can join an e-club. And you can join into, I think, what will be a way of peacefully approaching the bigger problems on the planet.
Nice. I think that's a very effective pitch. And thank you so much for all of the work that you do. I know you get involved in so many different projects, and it's very easy to say, like, oh, this is my profession and this is what I do. But you've managed to tie in and work on so many different challenges, whether it's tying in climate and sustainability along with health, which is not something that people normally do, but it's still so incredibly important. So thank you for doing all that you do. And the first question that came to mind for me as you were talking about this is, how do you know which hospitals to go to? How do you know what to take? Is there a way of just, these are the supplies that are broadly necessary? How do you go about planning for this?
To answer that question, which was quite specific for Ukraine, because we didn't know, and that was one of the reasons why I felt we needed to travel there and actually see the hospitals. And it was to a certain extent eye-opening, because some of the hospitals weren't really in as much need. Obviously, they are very short on the front line. So we did send a lot of antibiotics and particularly anti-inflammatories to the troops that were on the front line. But in general, your point is well made. And whether it's Central America like Guatemala or whether it's Kenya, unless you meet the people, you won't really know. And so for me, I found it doesn't make a lot of sense just to load up a container and send it off if you don't know where it's going to land. So that's what I mean by the last mile. The last mile is critical because if it's not going to the right place, or sometimes it gets to a place where it's just sold off and they collect the money and it never really gets to where the need is. I think that's one of the advantages I found with Rotary, is that I connect with Rotary clubs in these different countries. So I've done that in Kenya. I've done that in Guatemala. I go to those hospitals, I meet the people, I actually try to determine what it is they really need before sending or taking anything.
Nice. That way you can make sure that what you're sending and what you're bringing is actually what's most important for those regions.
Right.
Yeah. Is there a way for people to help that are not necessarily doctors, who can't like wave a medical license at an airport security guard and get stuff through? Is there a way for people to help with the work that you're doing?
I get asked that question a lot. And if there's anybody listening or watching that has ever been interested in the medical field, and I'm guessing there probably, if you're in a university audience, there's going to be several, that really the best way is to explore through the internet or through me. Feel free to email me anytime. Explore the nonprofits that, depending on where you're most interested in working or what field you're interested in working in, work with a nonprofit that has an organized process. For example, we have something called Matibabu and Tiba, Kenya, that does work in East Africa. And you don't have to be a doctor. Actually, most of the work I've done has been with college students and medical students that have come and worked in the operating room sometimes, or sometimes just in the local, with the community health workers going out. Likewise, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but Rotary has a lot of international projects that you can join in. The one that I'm most involved in with cervical cancer is called PINCC, stands for Prevention International of Cervical Cancer. And we take a lot of younger people on those trips, depending on where you want to go. We've done projects in India, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Central America. My next project's going to be in Bolivia. I'm very excited to get down to South America finally. All my life I wanted to go to South America. I keep ending up in the wrong country, but I think I'll finally get there. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And you've shared a little bit about what the challenges are right now with the last mile and the waste of medical supplies. But what would be your vision for what a solution to this might be? Whether that be like eliminating medical waste from the US entirely, which is of course a broader challenge, but even on a smaller scale, like in order to deliver medical supplies for that last mile, what are some changes that you think would make that a more effective process or a more streamlined one? If that makes sense. I can always rephrase that question.
No, it makes very good sense, but it's also, I think, I really believe it requires a change in consciousness on the planet. And I think it requires a political understanding that as long as we have nations which have a very self-determined and self-centered goal of growth in whatever, whether it's communist or whether it's the liberal market method, whatever it is, we have to find a way to live on the planet that is more sustainable. And so you get into, this is what we now call the age of uncertainty. This is what I think your generation is looking at. You've got the problems of climate change. You have the problems of potentially nuclear war, and you have the problems of the economy. And I think all of these factors are going to be so hard to overcome without young people having new ideas and new ways for how we work together. And so I sort of decided, I wrote a book. If you ever want to read an interesting novel, I'll give you a little pitch. There's one called The Watergate Spies. It's a spy story by the way, one of the greatest writers on the CIA is somebody from Stanford. She's a professor who's absolutely brilliant, who wrote a book called Spies, Lies, and Traitors, and Algorithms. But my book will tell you that basically, at some point we have to give up this sort of continued autocracy and national consciousness that involves, I think, getting away from what is going to keep the earth in a way that we don't destroy it, particularly through climate change, but who knows, maybe even nuclear weapons. And that means we have to give up more than just thinking in terms of nations. And we need to think that ultimately we're all earthlings. So I consider myself now to be more of an earthling than an American, even though that's my final answer to your question, Shreya, is travel, see the world. Go and find how other people live and learn their languages. That's the joy of that's the adventure of life to me. Travel all you can.
That would be a beautiful ending, but unfortunately, I have one more question for you.
Oh.
We've talked a little bit about getting medical supplies internationally, and obviously, no one can deny that's an extremely pressing need. But can you talk a tiny bit about the challenge of equity in health systems today, like in the US itself? And also, even if we're not taking medical supplies and putting them to use elsewhere, can we still reduce the waste in another way, even just reducing just diversion from the landfill, even if we're not reusing those supplies for people? That's kind of two questions, but go in any order you want.
Well, I'm gonna say that this is a whole nother presentation, but okay. In a nutshell, our system of medicine in America is broken. Yeah. It's been a market-based system of medicine for the last 200 years, and we don't have equivalency of longevity and control of disease that countries like Canada and England and Switzerland have, and yet it costs twice as much. So our system is broken. And that's particularly true when you look at the pharmaceutical industry and how it's designed. We lost 100,000 people due to deaths from narcotics, and much of that was started and now is sort of the finger is being pointed at pharmaceutical industries because they made such utilization of oxycodone and other narcotics that many people got addicted. And once they developed the addiction, it's led to an epidemic of narcotics in the country. 100,000 people. That's absolutely astonishing. So how do you fix it? How do you get beyond that? And honestly, it is very much, I think, a political solution. And it's going to take a lot of time. I don't see this getting resolved in less than the next 10 to 20 years, but it will be from essentially the efforts of people that go into the field of medicine and people that go into political worlds. And in the international field, I'll give you an example of what we're trying to do with cervical cancer. It's the cost of vaccines that makes it impossible, because to get a vaccine for HPV in the United States is around $120 to $140. Well, India is now producing them at $2.50 a vaccine. And so, part of the solution is going to come from China. It's going to come from India, where they don't have quite the fixation on a market-based system that is controlled basically by corporations.
Okay. Well, that's a rather dismal note to end on. But thank you for sharing all the work that you do and for putting together that very insightful PowerPoint presentation to guide us through all of that. Can I ask you to rep the name of your book so that people can check it out?
Oh, of course. Actually, I'm going to have to mention two books, but okay. If you get interested, the website is rgodfreybooks.com, and one book is on East Africa, and it's a nonfiction book it's a biography of three incredible people in the field of environmentalism. One of them was Wangari Maathai, who got the Nobel Prize and who planted more than 10 million trees in Kenya alone. The other book is about a different period of time, but it's not too dissimilar from what we're experiencing currently with the polarization that goes on in America. And it's called The Watergate Spies, a novel. But it's not under my name. It's under the name of Delta Tango. He's a double agent that's working for Castro. So that one's a little more out there.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much.